I still remember the dust, the perpetual fine layer that coated everything in the Vatican's secret archives. It clung to the air, to my clothes, to the very essence of my being, a silent witness to centuries of forgotten knowledge. For years, I, Dr. Alastair Finch, a lowly but devoted philologist, had toiled within its hallowed, oppressive walls, deciphering brittle parchments, cataloguing theological esoterica, and occasionally sifting through the dross of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. My life was one of quiet erudition, a monastic existence punctuated only by the turning of pages and the hushed echoes of my own thoughts. I prided myself on my rational mind, my unwavering belief in the tangible, the empirically verifiable. A foolish pride, as it turns out, for the archives hold more than mere history. They hold an insidious patience. The request had been innocuous enough. Locate any extant copies of a minor 13th century penitential manual, Libellus Ponitentium, believed to contain a unique commentary on auricular confession. Routine. Tedious, even. I'd spent weeks navigating the labyrinthine stacks, the air growing colder the deeper I ventured into sections rarely disturbed. It was behind a misfiled, oversized breviary, tucked into a niche that barely existed on any official map, that I found it. Not the libellus, but it. A small, unassuming volume, bound in what I initially assumed was cured human skin, a common enough macabre practice in certain medieval periods, though always unsettling. The cover was devoid of any title, only a single, intricate symbol pressed into the dark, leathery surface, a kind of intertwined knot that seemed to squirm beneath my fingers. Liber non dictus, I later learned to call it, the unspoken book. My initial reaction was academic curiosity, tinged with a professional thrill. An uncatalogued manuscript, a genuine discovery. I should have stopped then, should have reported it immediately, allowed the proper channels to absorb its mystery. But the symbol, it felt ancient, radiating an almost imperceptible hum that resonated in my chest, a low thrumming like a distant, primordial drum. I felt compelled, not by intellect, but by something far more fundamental, to open it myself, alone, in the hushed sanctity of my small, lamplit office. The first page was blank, save for a spidery script in a language I recognized as a deeply archaic Latin dialect, but twisted, almost wrong. My philological training was stretched to its limits. Veritas qui non est de Dio, it began, a truth that is not of God. I remember a chill, not of cold, but of something deeper seeping into my bones. The further I delved, the more unsettling the text became. It wasn't heresy in the traditional sense, not a denial of doctrine, but rather a grotesque reinterpretation of it. It spoke of confession not as an act of divine absolution, but as a transaction, a feeding. The whispers in the confessional, the text claimed, were not merely the prayers of the penitent, nor the counsel of the priest. They were sustenance. It described an entity, qui audit, the listener, an ancient presence residing in the liminal spaces at the edges of sacred sites, patient for the moment of utter vulnerability, the moment a soul unburdens itself, not to God, but to the silence that mimics God. Et audiant voces animarum, et nutriri, the script chillingly stated, and they hear the voices of souls and are nourished. I found myself working late into the night, the archival gloom pressing in on me, no longer comforting but suffocating. The candles flickered, and the shadows danced, mimicking forms in my peripheral vision. I thought it was fatigue, the strain of deciphering the arcane script, the psychological impact of such dark theology. I told myself it was just a fevered dream, a medieval delusion, a forgotten Gnostic offshoot. But the book felt alive. Its pages, originally stiff, began to soften, to almost breathe beneath my fingers. The air in my office grew colder, not just a draft, but an unnatural, pervasive chill that radiated from the manuscript itself. I should have stopped when I found the passages detailing specific names, not of saints or demons, but of resonant frequencies, primordial invocations that promised to draw qui audit closer. Nominatim vocia, it warned, to call by name, was the irreversible act. But I kept reading, driven by a morbid fascination that had utterly consumed my academic detachment. My mind, once a fortress of reason, was slowly being breached, its foundations eroded by the insidious suggestions of the liber non dictus. I began to feel watched, an omnipresent gaze from the darkened corners of my office, from behind the stacks of forgotten texts. The whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, were no longer just the rustling of parchment. They were indistinct murmurs, layered and guttural, like 1,000 dry throats attempting to speak at once, just beyond the threshold of my hearing. They seemed to echo the very words I was reading, repeating phrases I had just deciphered. Veritas qui non est de Dio qui audit, nominatum vocia. The mistake, the final, irrevocable error, was not in speaking a name aloud. It was in understanding it. It was in comprehending the dreadful truth that certain concepts, once fully grasped by the human mind, become an invocation in themselves. As I pieced together the final, horrifying implications of liber non dictus, that the confessional was merely a trap, the priest an unwitting conduit, and the whispered sin a spiritual meal for something ancient and ravenous, I felt a shift. A subtle, internal click, like a lock turning in a forgotten chamber of my skull. The knowledge became not just information, but a resonance, a frequency. My mind, now saturated with its truth, had become a beacon, broadcasting my newfound awareness. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a distinct murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the very air I breathed. The shadows in my office elongated, twisting into forms that were almost, but not quite human. They watched me. I felt their ancient, famished gaze. I understood then the rule no one speaks aloud, that the greatest secret isn't what you confess, but what you come to know about the listener, for then you, too, become part of the confession, the offering. I had not merely read about Qui Audit. I had been perceived by it. The book wasn't just a text. It was a key, and I, in my hubris, had used it to unlock a door that was never meant to be opened. Now every creak of the ancient building, every rustle of paper, every single moment of silence is filled with a dreadful certainty. They are here. The knowledge burns, a cold flame that consumes me from within, and I cannot unlearn it. The desperation gnaws at me. It's a physical thing, a dry claw raking at my throat, demanding I speak, demanding I unburden myself of the horrific knowledge I now possess. But where do I go? Who do I tell? The church, my life's unwavering bedrock, has become the very source of my torment, its ancient walls holding not just solace but unthinkable secrets. And the booth. I shouldn't have gone back to that booth. Not after what I found in the archives. Not after the Codex Umbrarum. I find myself drawn to it, though, like a moth to a flickering, poisonous flame. The small, claustrophobic space in the vestry of Santa Maria in Val. It's a habit, a ritual ingrained since seminary, a place of silent reckoning. But the air within it no longer moves, yet it feels strangely occupied. A stillness that is not peace but stagnation, thick with something indefinable, something cold and clinging, like the ghost of a breath that isn't my own. A metallic tang, like old blood, laces the musty fabric of the confessional screen. I imagine it's just the dust, the stale air of a forgotten corner, but a tendril of primal dread coils in my stomach, a premonition I can't shake. I slide onto the worn kneeler, the wood groaning beneath me as if in protest, or perhaps agreement. My fingers, trembling slightly, trace the rough-hewn lattice of the confessional screen. I press my face close, inhaling deeply not for spiritual balm, but for an explanation of the lingering scent. It's not incense, not candle wax, not human sweat. It's something deeper, more ancient, like damp earth or perhaps the scent of a stone crypt long sealed and then pried open. The words I found in that damned Codex Umbrarum replay themselves in my mind, fragments of Latin, archaic and guttural, like incantations. They aren't just words, they're keys. I tried to dismiss them as historical curiosities, the fevered delusions of a heretic scribe. I told myself it was mere folklore, a dark undercurrent of forgotten Gnosticism, dismissed by the Council of Nicaea, eradicated by the Inquisition. But now, in the chilling silence of the booth, those syllables resonate, not as memory, but as whispers. They coil around my ears, so clear and distinct, yet intangible, as if spoken by 1,000 dry tongues at once. Vox in vacuitas, nomen non scriptum, voice in the void, name unwritten. It started subtly, an inflection in my own thoughts, a slight elongation of a vowel when I mentally recited a passage from the Liber Tenebris. Then I heard it outside my head. My own voice, repeating the forbidden lines from the Codex, but warped, stretched, as if distorted by distance and a terrible pressure. It's not an echo in the acoustic sense. It's a living thing, a shadow that mimics sound, a repetition that adds something, twists the meaning, infuses it with a cold, malevolent weight. I should have stopped when I first noticed the chill, the sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the Florentine autumn outside. I should have understood then that this wasn't mere research, that I wasn't just reading. I was engaging. But I kept reading, didn't I? Driven by an academic obsession, a forbidden hunger for the truth buried beneath millennia of dogma, the true names, the opus tenebrarum, the dark work. A cosmology so blasphemous, so utterly antithetical to everything I dedicated my life to, that it felt like an acid eroding my very soul. I had thought it was simply a suppressed heresy, a footnote in the Vatican's vast, blood-stained history. Now I understand it's a living threat, a name that summons, a ritual that transcends parchment and ink, spilling into the tangible world. I push my hand against the rough wood, bracing myself. I close my eyes, trying to focus on the familiar words of contrition, the ritual of confession that has always offered sanctuary. But the whispers intensify, a chorus of sibilant voices forming my own thoughts, yet subtly altering them. Peccavi nimis cogitation, verbo operet omission. I have sinned greatly in my thoughts, words, deeds, and omissions. But the echo, that cold, unseen thing, finishes the phrase for me, twisting it. Et in nomen quod non debui sire. And in the name which I should not have known. My eyes snap open. It's not in my head. I hear it. A faint, dry rustling from the other side of the screen, as if something shifts within the priest's empty compartment. A breath, a sigh, a slow, deliberate exhalation that prickles the hairs on my neck. The air, already heavy, becomes almost suffocating. My heart pounds against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. This ritual, this act of seeking absolution has changed. It's no longer a path to forgiveness. It's a door. And every repetition, every whispered syllable of the forbidden knowledge, pushes it wider. I know the rule. I know I cannot confess this. The true nature of my transgression, the content of what I discovered, is not a sin to be absolved. It is a contagion to be contained, a secret the Vatican has buried under layers of dogma, secrecy, and I now suspect blood. To speak it aloud, even to a priest behind a screen, is to grant it power, to acknowledge its presence in the sacred space. But the compulsion is overwhelming. I have to confess. Perhaps if I just hint at it, obliquely, without naming names, without detailing the ritual. My breath catches. I lean closer to the screen, my voice a desperate, cracking whisper. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been many days since my last confession, and since then I have seen things, read things, things that no man should ever know, secrets that threaten the very foundations of. A sound, not a word, not a gasp, but a wet, tearing whisper that seems to come from directly beside my ear, yet also from within the stone walls themselves. A sound like silk ripping, or ancient paper being torn, or perhaps skin. It's accompanied by an undeniable surge of cold, so intense it makes my teeth chatter. The metallic tang in the air intensifies, sickeningly sweet now, like the scent of an abattoir. The echo answers. It's my own voice, yes, but distorted by an impossible resonance, layered with a guttural, inhuman growl that vibrates through the very wood of the confessional. It repeats my last words, but not exactly. Foundations of IT. The last word, it, is not mine. It's alien, ancient, thick with an unspeakable hunger, elongated into a drawn-out hiss that ends in a soft, wet slurp. It comes from the other side of the screen, right there, just inches from my face. And then I see it, not through the lattice, but projected somehow onto the inner surface of my eyelids, though my eyes are wide open. A fleeting, impossible image. A single, vast, unblinking eye, an impossible shade of bruised violet, swirling with nebulae of black and green, watching me from the other side. I thought I was just imagining it, a trick of a sleep-deprived mind, until the metallic tang in the air condensed. just for a moment, into something palpable. A single drop, cold and viscous, lands on my cheek just below my eye. I don't dare move. I don't dare breathe. I just feel it slowly, deliberately, tracing a path down my skin. The booth isn't empty. It never was. I am trapped, forever bound to a knowledge that bleeds from the page into the world, and I fear the door I opened can never be closed. I remember the silence of the chapel. It wasn't the kind of peace one hopes for, not the reverent hush of a place dedicated to divinity. No, this was the silence of something held in check, a vast, patient emptiness that simply waited. The air was cold, damp, smelling of old stone and neglected incense, a scent that now clings to my clothes, my skin, my very thoughts. I had fled there, you understand, after the night spent poring over the forbidden folios, the unholy annotations scribbled in margins of texts the Vatican guards with a zeal that borders on the fanatical. I had delved too deep into the Codex Obscura, chasing whispers of forgotten rituals, of names that summon, not merely invoke. My mind, already a tattered tapestry of doubt and conspiracy, craved the stark, unwavering light of faith, any faith, to push back the creeping shadows of what I had learned. I knelt there, a solitary figure in a cavernous space, the stained glass windows depicting saints in agony, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every tremor. My knees pressed against the worn kneeler, numb to the cold, numb to everything but the throbbing ache behind my eyes and the desperate need to unlearn. I had come to pray, to beg for absolution, to ask for the erasure of the words that had burned themselves into my memory like brands. Words like voco umbri, audite vox me, I call the shadows hear my voice. Words I dismissed as archaic superstitions until the whispers began. There was a votive candle, one of dozens in the side chapel, left burning, perhaps by a devout cleaning woman or an oversight. It was the only one alight amidst the rows of cold, spent wax. Its flame was a defiant tremor against the pervasive draught that snaked through the ancient stones. It shouldn't have been burning so steadily. The wax, a pale yellow, bled down the side of its small glass holder, congealing in thick rivulets onto the pristine white altar cloth. But it wasn't just wax. It seemed to shimmer with an unnatural hue in the dimness, like dried blood or something darker, something alive. I remember thinking, quite clearly, how peculiar it looked, how out of place, a single point of defiant light in a chapel that felt devoid of true solace. I should have extinguished it then. I should have turned and fled. But I stayed. I clasped my hands, my fingers cold and stiff, and began to recite the Pater Noster, the familiar words a flimsy shield against the encroaching dread. But the prayer felt alien, hollow. Each syllable felt stolen, regurgitated from a distant past. And the candle flame, it did not bow. It flickered, yes, but not with the caprice of a normal flame. It danced with an almost deliberate rhythm, casting long, wavering shadows across the chapel walls. And in those shadows, something began to coalesce. At first I thought it was my mind, frayed by sleepless nights and the weight of forbidden knowledge, playing tricks on me. Simple pareidolia, perhaps, but the shapes became clearer, more distinct. Faces. Gaunt, ancient visages not of saints nor of demons, but of something far older, far more indifferent. They pressed too close, their features indistinct yet utterly horrifying, like reflections glimpsed in clouded glass. And their lips moved. It mirrored my silent prayer. As I formed the words in my mind, Pater Noster, qui is in celis, I saw their shadowy mouths echo them, silently, perfectly. They spoke my words before I even had the chance to voice them. They were not merely reflecting, they were anticipating. They were inside my head, riding the currents of my thoughts, knowing my supplications before I had fully conceived them. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences. The cold deepened, pressing in on me like a physical weight. My voice, when I finally dared to speak the words aloud, was a mere croak, lost in the echoing void. I thought I was imagining it until I paused mid-sentence, deliberately to test my sanity. The shadowy lips paused too, then began again, finishing the prayer fragment, their movements eerily synchronized with the silent words that were still forming in my own mind. They knew. The panic that then clawed its way up my throat was primal, visceral. It wasn't just shadows on a wall, it was a revelation of utter invasion. My thoughts, my sanctuary, my very self had been breached. I scrambled backward, away from the altar, away from the relentless, knowing flame. My eyes darted from the shifting phantoms on the walls back to the candle itself, searching for the trick, the hidden projector, the logical explanation. But there was none. The flame continued its impossible dance, its light unwavering, the blood wax still spilling unhurriedly onto the cloth. And then I saw it, the wick. It was black, utterly, completely carbonized, consumed. There was no thread left to burn, no fuel to draw. It was a charred stub, a skeletal finger of what once was, yet the light still burned. A steady, resolute, self-sustaining illumination that defied every law of physics, every natural order I had ever known. The flame was not fed by the wick, nor by the wax. It was fed by something else, something I could not name, but whose presence I felt as a suffocating pressure. A perpetual dread, burning from a source beyond comprehension. This wasn't a trick of light or mind. It was a fundamental violation of reality, a tear in the fabric. The Codex Obscura had hinted at such things, at energies that could be drawn from beyond the veil, at eternal fires that consumed nothing, yet burned with an unholy fervor. I had dismissed them as allegory, fool, stultus. This was no allegory. This was the truth bleeding through, staining the sacred with the profane. I should have stopped when I read the first forbidden passage. I should have closed the book, locked it away, pretended I never saw the cryptic diagrams or the ancient sigils. But I kept reading, driven by a scholar's insatiable curiosity, a foolish belief that knowledge was power, that understanding could protect me. But this knowledge was a poison. It had opened a door I could not close, and now the things that watched from the other side were here, in the chapel, in my mind, burning with a light that needed no fuel but my own unraveling sanity. The conspiracy wasn't just Vatican secrets, it was cosmic. The Church knew. They guarded these texts, not to keep them from the faithful, but to keep the faithful from what lay within. Because once you see it, once you truly understand, there's no going back. The light, the impossible light, pulsed with malevolent knowing, illuminating not just the chapel, but the dark, inescapable corners of my soul. And now the light is everywhere, even in the darkness behind my eyes. I often reflect on the precise moment of my undoing. It wasn't a grand, cataclysmic event, but rather a series of insidious choices, each one seemingly innocuous, a minor deviation from the path, until the cumulative effect became a chasm. The first confession was born of curiosity, the second of hubris. But the third was an act of desperate, terrified submission. I had stumbled upon something within the Vatican's hidden archives, a series of microfiche records so deliberately misfiled, so meticulously obscured, that their very existence was a scream. The language was an archaic form of Latin, interwoven with what I initially dismissed as mere scribbles, until the patterns began to emerge, forming sigils, symbols that hummed with a resonance I could not yet name, but felt in the hollow of my chest. My academic instinct, that insatiable hunger for the esoteric, for the suppressed histories, drove me forward. I should have stopped when the first chill settled into my bones, a cold that wasn't of the ancient library's temperature, but of something deeper, something alien. But I kept reading. The document, which I later identified as a fragmented copy of the Liber Tenebrarum, the Book of Shadows, a text supposedly destroyed by papal decree during the Renaissance, spoke of invocations of the lesser keys, not as a metaphor, but as a literal instruction manual. It detailed a cosmology so blasphemous, so utterly divergent from any established theological framework, that it made the Gnostic heresies seem like children's fables. It described entities that were not fallen angels or benevolent spirits, but something other, something pre-creation, dwelling in the spaces between concepts. The words themselves seemed to writhe on the page, the ink pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible light when held at a certain angle. My hands trembled, a tremor that began as excitement, an academic thrill, but swiftly morphed into something akin to premonition, a cold dread seeping into my fingertips. The more I deciphered, the more the lines between reality and the text blurred. I started seeing the sigils, the strange interlocked patterns in the grain of the library's ancient wooden tables, in the condensation trails on my windowpane. I dismissed it as ocular fatigue, the strain of hours spent poring over faded script. But then came the whispers, at first indistinct, like the rustling of old parchment, then clearer, forming syllables that seemed to brush against the periphery of my hearing, always just out of focus. They spoke of names. Names that were not words in any human tongue, but resonant frequencies, vibrations meant to pry open fissures in the fabric of existence. The book warned against their utterance, against even their contemplation, for merely knowing them was an act of terrible invitation. Cognitio est portas aperiant. It stated, knowledge is the opening of gates. The irony is palpable. I, a scholar dedicated to illumination, had inadvertently sought out the deepest, most primordial darkness. The final, damning passage of the Liber Tenebrarum was not an incantation, but a narrative, a historical account of a forgotten rite performed by a rogue sect of Dominicans in the 13th century. It chronicled their discovery of these lesser keys, and the ensuing cataclysm that consumed them, erasing them not just from history, but from memory itself. Yet the text wasn't just descriptive, it was prescriptive. It didn't just tell what happened, but how it happened, detailing the precise sequence of thoughts, the mental focus required to attune oneself to the entities described. It spoke of a third confession, not to a priest, but to the void itself, an acknowledgement of its primacy, a surrender to its truth. And that is where I broke. I was alone in my study, the Liber Tenebrarum spread open before me, its pages now appearing almost moist, the ink impossibly blacker than before. The room had grown deathly cold, the kind of cold that steals the breath from your lungs. The shadows in the corners were no longer static. They shifted, congealed, hinting at forms that defied Euclidean geometry. I could feel eyes on me, countless, ancient eyes, pressing in from beyond the veil. And in that suffocating presence I understood. The third confession was not about absolution, but about affirmation. It was a conscious choice to accept the reality of what I had read, to acknowledge the existence of the unfathomable. It was the ultimate blasphemy, not against God, but against the comforting lie of order. The words left my mouth then, not in a shout, but a whisper, dragged from my chest like rusty anchors. I spoke the third confession, a phrase I had found embedded deep within the text, not a prayer, but a declaration of intellectual and spiritual surrender. Ego cognoscit, ego accipit, ego sum porta. I know I accept I am the gate. The moment the final syllable passed my lips, the chill intensified to an unbearable degree, and a sound, like the universe exhaling through a cracked bone, filled the room. The wood grain of my ancient desk seemed to pulse, to breathe, like veins beneath thin skin. The shadows solidified for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to glimpse something that moved with an unnatural fluidity, a vastness that defied the confines of my small study. Then silence, a silence that wasn't merely the absence of sound, but an active, suffocating presence. It felt like the air itself had inhaled, holding its breath, waiting. The priest's silhouette from my memory of the confessional booth, the one where I'd confessed my initial academic transgression, was no longer still. It rippled, elongated, becoming something else entirely, no longer human. I wasn't just recalling a memory, I was re-experiencing it, the past bleeding into the present, distorted by what I had unleashed. The third confession had sealed it. What was only waiting on the other side was no longer waiting. It was here with me, inside me, woven into the very fabric of my perception. I had not just opened a gate, I had become one. Now every night, the silence inhales around me, and I know I am never truly alone. My initial foray into the Vatican archives felt like a sacred trespass, an intellectual heist. I considered myself a scholar, immune to the superstitious dread that gripped the less informed. I sought truth, a purer understanding of ancient faiths, convinced that all myth held a kernel of human experience, easily dissected and categorized. But I was foolish. My arrogance blinded me to the fact that some truths are not meant to be known, some knowledge is not meant to be found. The books, bound in leathers that felt too much like skin, whispered of things that existed before the word, before the light. My academic curiosity was a sickness, you see, a malignant tumor of the intellect that demanded feeding relentlessly. I remember the chill that permeated the very stones of the ancient church I eventually found myself in, drawn by a marginal note in a forbidden manuscript. It wasn't merely the temperature, it was an absence, a void that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. The air itself felt thick, not with dust, but with something far heavier, a palpable tension. I told myself it was the natural decay of an old building, the quiet dignity of forgotten holiness. I told myself that the faint, resonant hum I began to detect was merely the wind whistling through ancient eaves, or perhaps the distant drone of traffic from the nearby city. But the hum was too deep, too constant, and it seemed to emanate not from outside, but from within the very fabric of the building, vibrating in my teeth, settling in my bones. I started to perceive subtle shifts, not in the visible architecture, but in the air itself. The walls, grand and solid as they appeared, began to feel hollow. Not structurally hollow, no, but as if their very essence had been scooped out, leaving a resonant cavity. And from this perceived hollowness, the murmurs began. At first, I dismissed them as auditory illusions, the tricks of an overactive mind fueled by too many late nights with forbidden texts. But they grew louder, coalescing from an undifferentiated hum into something structured, something almost linguistic. It was Latin, I realized with a jolt, but not the liturgical Latin I knew, not the precise, measured phrases of Mass or the serene cadences of ancient hymns. No, this was raw, fragmented, as if scratched into the very stone from within, desperate and yearning. The syllables trembled through the plaster, a continuous low thrum that was less heard and more felt. They didn't just reach my ears, they seemed to bite, sharp little stings that made my scalp prickle. Ad profundum, vocia in tenebris, I caught fragments like whispers snatched from a dream. Satyr, teen, the meaning eluded me, just beyond the grasp of my extensive classical education, hinting at something ancient, something wrong. It was a corruption of the familiar, like hearing a beloved melody played on broken strings by a madman. I told myself I was tired, that the isolation was getting to me. I even tried to rationalize it as a unique acoustic phenomenon, a resonance chamber of old prayers reverberating through centuries. But the dread was too visceral, too persistent to be dismissed by logic alone. Then came the statues. They were old, many of them, their faces softened by time and neglect, but they still held an air of solemnity. I noticed it first on a figure of the Madonna, a dark, greasy sheen beneath her eyes. Wax, I thought, from old candles, poorly cleaned. But then I saw it on another and another. It was a slow, viscous trickle gathering at the base of their pedestals. And the smell, oh God, the smell. It was cloying and sweet, yet putrid like old flesh, decaying slowly in a forgotten tomb. It wasn't the smell of human decomposition, not quite. It was something deeper, older, a scent that prickled the back of my throat and tasted of iron and despair. It was the smell of things that had been living, but were no longer, and yet were still present. Beneath the faint, almost imperceptible echo of what should have been hymns, for the church stood empty and silent, untouched by regular services, I began to discern another sound, a rhythm. It was slow and deep, a pulse that seemed to beat in counterpoint to my own frantic heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was too deep to be a drum, too regular to be anything natural. It was a cadence that felt primal, ancient, older than psalms, older than any written scripture. It was the rhythm of a heart, perhaps, but one that beat outside of time, outside of life, a heart that had been beating for untold millennia, waiting. And then it clicked, a horrifying realization that shattered my carefully constructed academic facade. The fragments of Latin, the weeping statues, the scent of ancient decay, the pulsing rhythm, they were all connected, all part of a single, terrible symphony. My steps in that echoing nave, once confident and purposeful, became hesitant, each one sounding unnaturally loud like a summons. I felt as if I were being watched, judged, expected. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the unseen presence swelling, pressing in. And the prayers, those whispered Latin fragments I'd been hearing from the walls, they weren't just echoes of past devotion. They were active. They were petitions, and they were being answered. Not by a benevolent God, but by the thing that beat beneath the hymns, the entity that wept through the statues, the horror that vibrated through the very stones. I had sought forgotten knowledge, but what I found was something that had never forgotten us, something that remembered the days before the temples, before the altars, before even the first spoken word. It remembered the taste of the earth and the silence before the light. And now it remembered me. Every step I take now is a beat in its ancient rhythm, a confirmation of its patient vigil. The silence of the sacristy always held a quality unlike any other space in the Vatican archives. It wasn't the reverent hush of the main library, nor the dry, dusty stillness of the lesser-used crypts. Here, the air felt heavy, laden with unsaid prayers and unspoken secrets, thick with the residue of countless rituals performed over centuries. I'd convinced myself, in my academic hubris, that it was merely the age of the vestments and liturgical instruments, the accumulated essence of consecrated objects. I was wrong, of course. I was so terribly, terribly wrong, and that particular error of judgment haunts my every waking moment, seeping into the thin veil between consciousness and the abyss. My permit, hard-won and meticulously scrutinized, granted me access to the lesser catalogued theological texts. A euphemism, I now understand, for materials the Holy See would rather forget, or at least keep firmly out of the public eye. I was looking for marginalia, a linguistic anomaly in an obscure 15th century missal, something utterly benign. But the sacristy, with its rows of dark wood cabinets and faint scent of old incense, pulled at me with an insidious magnetism. Behind a stack of worn chasubles, in a compartment that seemed deliberately obscured, my fingers brushed against something cold, something that didn't belong. It was a book. It wasn't ornate, not like the gilded liturgical texts I usually handled. This was a ledger, plain and austere, bound in what felt like human skin, though I dismissed the thought as a morbid fancy born of too many late nights in the archives. Its cover was a dark, unadorned leather, stiff and cold, bearing no title, no embellishment save for a single, deeply etched symbol on the spine, a twisting knot of lines that seemed to devour itself. I remember the immediate, visceral jolt that ran through me, a primal alarm bell screaming for me to recall, to put it back, to walk away and pretend I'd never seen it. But the scholar in me, the arrogant, insatiable thirst for knowledge, was already intoxicated by the forbidden. My hands, steady and confident just moments before, trembled slightly as I pulled it from its hiding place. It was heavier than it looked, possessing a strange, inert weight, like a block of solidified dread. The pages, when I finally managed to pry the covers open, were thick vellum, aged to a yellowed parchment, and they were filled, not with scripture or sermon, but with names. Thousands of them, meticulously pennied in a script that defied any chronological classification, some elegant, flowing copperplate, others a stark, angular Gothic, still others a hurried, desperate scrawl. They ranged from archaic Roman cognomens to names that sounded distinctly modern, names I felt a strange, unsettling familiarity with, though I couldn't place them. I ran my finger down a column, a chill snaking up my arm. Caius Lucius, Elena of Aquitaine, Giovanni Battista Montini, the names of popes and emperors, forgotten poets and infamous heretics. And then there it was, halfway down the page, nestled between Agnes de Valois and an unknown Klaus Richter, my own name. My full name, precisely as it appears on my passport, in an ink that somehow seemed fresher, starker than the rest, yet already beginning to merge with the vellum itself. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even touched the book until moments before. But there it was, an indelible stain on a page that felt ancient, eternal. A cold sweat slicked my palms. My breath caught in my throat, a painful knot of fear tightening in my chest. I blinked, trying to rationalize it away. A trick of the light, a bizarre coincidence, a cruel joke, but the ink didn't waver. It was my name, undeniably. And as I stared, a horrifying realization began to dawn. The edges of the letters, particularly around my own name, were subtly, almost imperceptibly, spreading. Like spilled water on blotting paper, but slower, more deliberate, as if the ink itself possessed a malignant will. I watched, mesmerized by terror, as a tiny tendril of black ink crept from the tail of my and began to consume a nearby Latin phrase, a liturgical blessing that now twisted into something unholy, its meaning lost in the creeping shadow. Domine Deus, Agnus Dei, Filius Patris. It started, but as the ink bled, the letters warped, transformed into jagged, claw-like symbols, whispering ancient obscenities in my mind, promises of dark bargains and debts yet to be paid. This wasn't an ordinary book. It was a living ledger, a grotesque financial instrument where souls were currency and sins were entries, meticulously recorded, accounted for, and transferred. My sins were not my own anymore. They were etched there, a debit against my name, perhaps even against my very being. The horror wasn't just that my name was in it, but that it was a transaction. I was part of a chain, a ledger of souls bound by some infernal contract I had unwittingly signed merely by existing, by sinning, by breathing. The other names on the page, the figures from history, the unknown souls, they were all part of this same horrifying accounting. What did the ink demand? What price did it exact for the privilege of life, for the transgressions of humanity? The questions screamed in my mind, but the book offered no answers, only a deeper, more profound sense of dread. The ink kept spreading, blotting the vellum, merging sentences, twisting them into grotesque sigils that vibrated with a silent, malevolent energy. My eyes darted across the pages, seeing the same phenomenon everywhere, now Latin scripture melting into hieroglyphs of suffering, sacred verses dissolving into blasphemous scrawls. The book was a living entity, a testament to a pact beyond human comprehension, devouring grace and spitting out damnation, page by agonizing page. I felt a cold pressure behind my eyes, a dizziness that threatened to consume me. My sanity, always a tenuous thing in the face of the truly bizarre, was fraying at the edges, threatening to unravel completely. I had to close it. The compulsion was overwhelming, a desperate instinct for self-preservation. My hands, still trembling, reached for the covers, but they felt impossibly heavy, slick, with an unseen moisture. It was like wrestling with a creature that did not want to be contained. With a final, desperate heave, I slammed the covers shut, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence of the sacristy. And that's when it happened. A single, dark, viscous tear of ink, thick and glistening like fresh blood, welled up from beneath the binding and slowly, deliberately, ran down the cold leather cover. It bled just for a moment, a single drop of infernal acknowledgement, before being absorbed back into the cover, leaving only a faint, phantom stain. I should have never touched it. Now my name is on its pages, and I feel its presence, always just at the edge of my perception, a whisper of cold ink on my soul. The silence of this room, the quiet hum of the ancient server, it's a fragile shield. I sit here, hunched over these screen fragments and hastily scrawled notes, my hands trembling as I try to make sense of the new topography of my dread. It's midnight again, always midnight, the hour when the veil thins, when the world I thought I knew peels back to reveal the grotesque substrata beneath. I tell myself it was a vision, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the insidious corruption of the liber tenebrarum. But the cold sweat that slicks my skin and the lingering stench of grave dust are far too real for a mere dream. I should have stopped when the footnotes began to contradict established theological history, when the marginalia whispered of a forgotten conclave, a synodus obscura held not to canonize saints, but to bind something infinitely older and more terrible. But I kept reading, a scholar's morbid curiosity dragging me deeper into the abyss, and now the abyss looks back, not with eyes, but with an echoing void. My research into the Vatican's hidden archives, those clandestine vaults whispered about in hushed tones by former colleagues now dismissed or worse, led me to fragmented records of the Cord Noctis, the Night Heart, a forgotten liturgical order, purged from history, their very existence an anathema. The texts spoke of their rites, their devotion not to the celestial light, but to the deep, silent things that predate the cosmos. One particular manuscript, bound in desiccated human skin and preserved by some dark miracle, detailed an invocation, a procession of the faceless, meant to be enacted only under specific astronomical alignments, during the profoundest darkness of the midnight hour. I dismissed it as symbolic, a metaphor for spiritual introspection, a grotesque poetic flourish. Until the night I found myself, inexplicably, drawn to the old derelict chapel on the outskirts of the city, its stained glass windows long shattered, its altar long overturned. The air inside was thick, cloying, like breathing through ancient cloth. My breath caught in my throat as the bells of a distant cathedral tolled 12 times, each peal a hammer blow against the fragile shell of my sanity. And then the sound began. Not a chant, not a song, but a rhythmic thump drag, footsteps, barely audible at first, muffled by the debris and the oppressive silence of the chapel, but growing undeniably closer. It was an impossible sound. I knew the place was abandoned, sealed decades ago. Yet, the distinct, deliberate march progressed, moving from what would have been the sacristy, down the ruined aisle, towards the desecrated altar. Every rational fiber in my brain screamed at me to flee, to dismiss it as a hallucination, a stress-induced psychosis. But I was rooted to the spot, hidden behind a fallen stone pillar, a morbid fascination outweighing the primal terror. The figures emerged then, slowly, one by one, from the deepest shadows near the chancel. There were 6 of them, tall and gaunt, draped in heavy, cowled robes of a material so dark, it seemed to absorb what little ambient light bled in through the broken roof. Their pace was agonizingly slow, deliberate, each step perfectly synchronized. My eyes, straining in the near absolute darkness, tried to discern their faces beneath the deep hoods, but there were no faces. Only smooth, unblemished, waxen flesh where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Blank. Utterly, unnervingly blank. It was as if their features had been gently, yet irrevocably, smoothed away, leaving behind only the terrifying implication of a human form that was no longer quite human. As they drifted down the aisle, their hands, gaunt and skeletal, were clasped before them. From their wrists, rosaries dangled, but these were not beads of wood or glass. They were small, irregularly shaped fragments of bone, each clattering with a dry, hollow sound against its neighbor, like teeth chattering in a frozen jaw. Click-clack, click-clack. It was the only sound besides their measured steps, a percussive, unsettling rhythm that echoed the beat of my own frantic heart. I was certain they could not see me, huddled there, barely breathing, but a horrifying intuition whispered that they did not need to see. Their blank faces seemed to turn slowly in my direction, not focusing, but perceiving, the sheer emptiness of their gaze more penetrating than any stare. It felt as though they were looking not at me, but through me, recognizing the forbidden knowledge that festered in my mind. They reached the front of the chapel, stopping before the fractured remains of the altar, arranged in a semicircle. Without a word, without a single gesture or command that I could perceive, they knelt. Not in prayer, not in supplication to any divine power I recognized. Their kneeling was an act of profound, terrible reverence directed at something else entirely. Their heads bowed, their blank faces now turned towards the cracked flagstones, their bone rosaries falling silent against their robes. The air grew impossibly heavy, charged with a palpable, unseen presence that pressed down on me, stealing the breath from my lungs. A low, resonant hum began to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating through the stone where I lay hidden, shaking me to my very core. It was the sound of something awakening, something vast and ancient. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they began to rise. One by one, their shrouded forms straightened, their blank faces once again turning towards the altar. But they were not rising alone. From the cracked earth beneath the altar, from the very foundations of that cursed place, a new form began to coalesce. It was not a physical entity in the conventional sense, not flesh and blood, but a vortex of shadow and shimmering, obsidian light, like a living tear in the fabric of reality. It writhed, expanded, filling the space with an icy dread that transcended mere fear. My mind, exposed to its sheer wrongness, threatened to unravel. This was the entity, the ignes infernales as the Liber Tenebrarum described, the abyssal fire they sought to commune with, not for divine grace, but for something far more primal and destructive. The figures stood motionless, their blank faces now angled upwards, as if offering themselves to this emerging darkness. The bone rosaries began to clatter again, but this time it was not a passive sound. It was an active, rhythmic rattling, building in intensity, a percussive invocation, each click a syllable in a language I could not comprehend but felt in my bones. The shadow form pulsed, its silent roar filling the chapel, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was witnessing an act of pure, unadulterated blasphemy, a summoning that would leave an indelible scar on the world. I should have turned away, should have gouged out my own eyes rather than bear witness, but my gaze was locked, horrified, to the swirling vortex that now filled the chancel, its unseen maw opening to devour not just light, but hope and reason itself. I do not know how long I lay there, paralyzed by the spectacle. Time lost its meaning, dissolving into the pulsing rhythm of the ritual. Eventually, as if on some unseen cue, the shadow form receded, retracting into the earth with a soundless sigh that resonated deep within my chest. The air lightened, though the dread remained, a permanent fixture. The hooded figures remained standing for another agonizing moment. Then, with the same horrifying slowness, they turned and began their procession back into the oppressive shadows from which they had emerged, their bone rosaries still clattering a quiet, terrible farewell. They left behind not just silence, but a void, a spiritual vacuum that pulled at the very essence of my being. I remember stumbling out of the chapel, into the pre-dawn chill, the scent of something foul and ancient clinging to my clothes, the phantom clatter of bone following me home. Now I understand. The Liber Tenebrarum was not merely a collection of apocryphal texts, it was a blueprint. The Vatican's centuries of secrecy, its guarded knowledge of demonic law, wasn't just about protecting humanity, but about burying the inconvenient truths of what else could be worshipped, what else held sway. These figures, the Cord Noctis, they were not mere cultists. They were practitioners of an ancient, forbidden art, maintaining a communion with entities that predate God, entities that slumber beneath the earth, waiting for the proper invocations to stir. And I, through my relentless pursuit of knowledge, my scholarly arrogance, have witnessed their terrible devotion, their faceless reverence for the unholy. I am marked by it, stained by a knowledge that sears my soul. The sound of those bone rosaries still echoes in the deepest parts of my mind, a perpetual reminder that I saw them, and they saw into me. The first light of dawn was always a lie for me, a flimsy curtain drawn across the true nature of the world. It promised renewal, a fresh start, but all it ever delivered was the stark, unflinching clarity of my own mounting despair. That particular morning, the pale fingers of the sun stretched across the cold stone floor of the ancient basilica, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like lost spirits. I had spent the night wrestling with the implications of the Palama's scrolls, specifically the redacted passages concerning the Opus Tenebrarum, and the weight of that forbidden law pressed down on me like a physical burden. My mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, was crumbling, besieged by whispers that seemed to emanate not from the pages, but from the very structure of the building around me. I needed to speak, to purge, to confess the blasphemous insights I was acquiring. The confessional booth, a dark wooden box tucked away in a shadowed alcove, seemed to beckon with an unnatural gravity. It was old, carved with saints whose faces were worn smooth by centuries of desperate pleas and whispered sins. As I approached, a chill wind, impossible within the enclosed space, snaked around my ankles. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible groan of aged timber, the small lattice door to the priest's side of the booth swung open, just a fraction. It hadn't been opened by any hand, not mine, not another. It simply moved. I froze, my hand still outstretched, poised to knock. My rational mind, or what little was left of it, screamed for me to turn and run, to flee this hallowed ground that suddenly felt more like a tomb. But something else, a morbid curiosity, a desperate, inherent yearning for the release I sought, propelled me forward. I told myself it was just the ancient mechanism, warped by time, giving way. I should have known better. Stepping inside, the air immediately felt heavier, thick with an almost tangible quiet. It wasn't the usual musty scent of old wood, beeswax, and lingering incense. There was something else, an undercurrent of something dry like dust, but also ancient, preserved. I slid onto the worn kneeler, the partition a dark, ornate screen between me and the unseen confessor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the echoing silence. Through the filigree, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure. He sat perfectly still, hands folded precisely in his lap, a posture of unnerving tranquility. Even in that dim light, I could sense the absolute stillness of him, a profound lack of the subtle shifts and movements that betray a living presence. I cleared my throat, the sound shockingly loud in the oppressive silence. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." My voice cracked, raw with sleepless nights and the secret burden. I began my usual litany, the petty transgressions, the resentments, the small cruelties. But even as the words left my lips, they felt inadequate, hollow, failing to convey the true, soul-rending horror of what I had been researching. I spoke of doubt, but not of the certainty of heresy I now harbored. I spoke of despair, but not of the dread I felt knowing the entities that truly presided over the hidden mechanisms of our world. All the while, the figure on the other side remained utterly motionless. Then he spoke. The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the small booth, resonating not just in my ears but in the very bones of my skull. It was deep, resonant, ancient, utterly devoid of inflection or human warmth. And yet his lips, through the lattice, remained perfectly still, a thin, unnaturally taut line. I strained my eyes, trying to discern the movement, the breath, the very life in him, but there was none. His skin, as best as I could perceive it in the gloom, seemed to be stretched too tight over the facial bones, like parchment pulled taut over a fragile frame, almost translucent in its pallor. It was an old man's skin, yes, but not in the way of natural agging, more like something carefully preserved, desiccated. He didn't acknowledge my confession. Instead, the voice, emanating from that unmoving, parchment-like face, began to speak. It wasn't questions, not in the traditional sense, but pronouncements. It spoke of cycles, of forgotten pacts, of names whispered in forgotten tongues. It spoke of the true nature of knowledge, not as illumination, but as a binding agent, a chain. "Your transgressions are but echoes," the voice intoned, the words cold and precise, each syllable a chisel against my composure. "The greater sin lies in what you sought to uncover, in the truths you disturbed." My heart lurched. He knew. He knew not just my sins, but the very nature of my intellectual trespass. His gaze, even through the screen, felt like a physical pressure, drilling into my very core. It was too long, too direct, too deep. It wasn't the compassionate, understanding gaze of a confessor. It was the assessing, possessive gaze of a curator examining a specimen. "You have sought the deeper currents," the voice continued, unwavering, "and by seeking, you have made yourself known to them." I felt a cold dread bloom in my stomach, spreading outwards. He wasn't absolving my guilt. He was confirming my damnation. He spoke of forbidden books I had only dared to glance at, passages from the Liber Ivanis, and the untranslated fragments of the cult's Des Gauls that I had meticulously cross-referenced with Vatican Apocrypha. How could he know these specifics? Then came the absolution. Not "I absolve you of your sins," but a string of Latin phrases I vaguely recognized from the most obscure footnotes of the Palama's scrolls, formulae for protection, for sealing, for binding. "Ego te consigno in aeternam servitutem. Anima tua est jam obligata, accaep vinculum." My grasp of ecclesiastical Latin wasn't perfect, but the gist was clear. "I consign you to eternal servitude. Your soul is now bound. Accept the chain." It wasn't absolution. It was a covenant, a dark sacrament, pronounced from that still, unmoving mouth. I felt a sudden, crushing weight descend upon my chest, a tightening in my very being, as if an invisible chain had indeed been fastened around my heart, pulling it taut. I gasped, struggling for breath, a choked sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. When I stumbled out of the confessional, the early morning light seemed blinding, harsh, utterly devoid of comfort. The world felt wrong, slightly off-kilter, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched and distorted during my brief encounter. My earlier desperation for release had been answered, yes, but not with peace. Instead, I had been bound, inextricably tied to the very horrors I sought to escape. The priest remained within the booth, A still, unmoving shadow, his gaze, I felt certain, still lingering upon me, an unseen tether. The absolution was not holy, it was utterly binding, a seal placed upon my soul, marking me as property. I was no longer just a researcher. I was a conduit, a vessel, permanently connected to the ancient, unspeakable entities that the unmoving priest served. My descent was complete. I carry the weight of that binding every waking moment, a cold certainty that I am merely an extension of something older, something utterly vast and malevolent. I should never have read the old script. That's the simple truth, the core of this crushing weight in my chest. I should have stopped when the vellum crackled under my gloved fingers, when the air in the Vatican secret archives grew suddenly, unnaturally cold, even for that subterranean vault. I remember the chill, a premonition I dismissed as the usual dampness of ancient stone, the lack of human warmth in a place designed to preserve secrets, not souls. But it was more than that, wasn't it? It was the initial whisper of something already there, stirred by my profane curiosity, waiting to be acknowledged. I was so arrogant, so convinced of my academic detachment, my scholarly immunity to the very subject I pursued with such fervor. I sought the forbidden, the suppressed, the texts deemed too dangerous for mortal eyes, and I found it. I found it. The codex was unassuming, bound in dark, unmarked leather, tucked away behind a false panel I'd only located through an obscure footnote in a much older, more innocuous inventory. Liber Ignis Aeterni, the title read in fadding Latin on the flyleaf, the Book of Eternal Fire. A bland title for such a terrifying compendium. It wasn't about hellfire, not in the theological sense. No, this was a manual of pre-Christian summoning, a taxonomy of entities so ancient, so utterly alien, that their very names were said to be anchors in our reality. The Church had not just censored it, they had tried to erase its very existence. And there I was, tracing the archaic script with my fingertips, inhaling the dust of millennia, convinced I was merely an academic unearthing a historical curiosity. I was wrong. Oh, how terribly, tragically wrong. The name, Vixarthal, was not just a sequence of syllables. It was a resonant frequency, a key. The text described it not as a demon that could be summoned, but one that simply was, a persistent parasitic presence in the interstitial spaces of creation, feeding on forgotten rites and unspoken fears. It said that Vixarthal wasn't brought into a place. It merely became perceptible to those who spoke its name, or more insidiously, to those who merely understood its true nature. That's what I did. I understood. And with that understanding, a door swung open, not to it, but within me. It started subtly, as these things always do. A flicker in my peripheral vision, gone the moment I turned my head. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, not localized, but seeming to emanate from just behind me. A cold breath that ruffled the fine hairs on my neck when no breeze was present. I'd be walking down a quiet hallway, and the sound of my own footsteps would suddenly seem hollow, as if something else was perfectly mimicking my stride, just half a step behind, its presence silencing the very echoes. I dismiss it as fatigue, as the psychological toll of intense research, as the flickering fluorescent lights of my temporary apartment in Rome. But the occurrences grew more frequent, more insistent, gnawing at the edges of my rational mind. I tried to pray. I, who had long since discarded overt piety for the rigorous dissection of faith, found myself clutching a rosary gifted by my devout grandmother, mumbling the familiar litanies. But the words felt like ash. They tasted of dust and rot on my tongue, devoid of power, devoid of comfort. Each Ave Maria felt like a direct affront, a blasphemous mockery, not to God, but to the cold, silent thing that now followed me. It wasn't just my faith that was failing, it was actively recoiling, as if the entity itself was absorbing the prayers, twisting them, making them unpalatable, useless. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, a spiritual claustrophobia. I saw it, or rather, I felt its impression, in the polished surface of my espresso cup. A distortion, a deepening of the reflection, a ripple that wasn't water. In the darkened glass of a shop window, I'd catch a glimpse, not of a form, but of a lack of light, a place where the reflections of the street behind me simply ceased. It wasn't a shadow. It was an absence of all light, all presence, yet profoundly present. It was always just out of focus, just beyond the threshold of direct perception, an eternal half-step behind, mirroring my movements with an eerie precision that suggested not imitation, but intimate connection. The paranoia is a constant companion now, a suffocating blanket. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, every mundane sound becomes a prelude to something terrible. I check the locks, I close the curtains, I turn on every light, but it makes no difference. It doesn't need physical entry. It's already here, inside the space, inside my perception, inside me. The text had warned of this. Those who glimpse its true nature become its mirrors, reflecting its eternal hunger, its ceaseless vigil. I am a mirror now, and it is the distorted reflection, forever behind me, closer than my own skin. I shouldn't have known the name. I shouldn't have understood. Now it's not a matter of escape, only of endurance. It never leaves. I often reflect on the insidious nature of true darkness, how it does not merely reside in the grand, terrifying pronouncements, but in the subtle shifts of atmosphere, the almost imperceptible changes that, in retrospect, were screaming warnings. My fascination with the Vatican's more obscure protocols, those unwritten decrees whispered in the hushed corridors of the Rota Romana, always felt like a harmless academic pursuit. I was a cartographer of forbidden knowledge, charting the theological fault lines of an institution built on millennia of secrets. The rule that cannot be broken twice, as it was obliquely referenced in ancient, decaying liturgical commentaries, seemed, at first, nothing more than an arcane safeguard against repeated heresy, a bureaucratic measure to manage rogue clerics. I should have known better. I should have stopped when I first found the marginalia in the Liber Vigiliarum, scrawled in a shaky hand that spoke of an unimaginable terror, describing not theological error, but peril of soul. The true nature of the rule was not in any official bull or encyclical, but encoded in the very structure of the confessionals themselves, in the forgotten rituals of penitence, and the highly specific formulations of absolution in the most esoteric rites. It wasn't about protection for the penitent, but containment for something far older and more malignant. My initial discovery was a faded diagram in a sealed annex of the Apostolic Library, nestled within a section designated Ad Cursus Nescientiam Animarum, a chilling title in itself. It depicted not a confessional booth, but an elaborate geometric pattern, a kind of metaphysical sieve, labeled the lattice. The rule, I slowly pieced together, mandated that no single priest could hear more than 2 confessions of a certain ritualistic gravity from the same individual. Not to spare the individual from ecclesiastical burden, but to prevent the thrice-spoken confession from becoming a key. A key to what? I hadn't yet grasped, but the terror implicit in the coded warnings sent a cold tremor down my spine. I thought I was merely studying archaic folklore, a testament to human fears. My downfall wasn't through malice, but meticulous academic zeal. I was studying the historical evolution of penitential rites, specifically those involving the formal renunciation of pre-Christian oaths, a fascinating intersection of theology and anthropology. To properly understand the cadence, the emotional weight, the linguistic nuances, I would often recite the confessions aloud in my private study, a quiet room filled with the scent of aged paper and lamp oil. The first time, it was a dispassionate exercise in phonetics. The second, a deeper immersion into the ritual's psychological impact. The third, I didn't even realize what I was doing. I was tracing a particularly intricate mea culpa, a litany of transgressions against the Lex Divina from a 15th century manuscript, the Codex Maleficarum. The words rolled off my tongue, rich with historical resonance, the Latin flowing with an ancient power I mistakenly believed was purely rhetorical. It was only when the last syllable died, when the air in my study seemed to thicken, pressing in on me with an unnatural silence, that a horrifying realization dawned. I had, in my academic arrogance, completed the cycle. I had opened the lattice and given it passage. The changes were subtle at first, insidious. My voice, My own familiar voice that had droned through countless lectures and whispered scholarly observations began to shift. There's a rasp now, an unexpected resonance, a guttural quality that emerges unbidden, often mid-sentence. Sometimes words slip out that I didn't intend to say, phrases alien to my own lexicon, imbued with an ancient malice. But it's my shadow that truly chills me. It moves with a terrifying independence. I see it out of the corner of my eye, a darker, heavier presence. It kneels when I do not. I'll be standing, reaching for a book, and catch my shadow on the wall, its form hunched, head bowed, in an act of blasphemous supplication. It's always behind me now, a constant, chilling weight, a coldness that seeps into my bones, even in the midday sun. It's a second presence, sharing my space, but not by invitation. The whispers began soon after, not audible to others, but clear as a bell in the echoing chambers of my skull. It's a voice that coils around my thoughts, subtly twisting them, planting insidious suggestions. And it delivered its new commandment. Once written, his sin will never end. This, then, is the ultimate horror. The knowledge I've painstakingly acquired, the truth I've unearthed, the very act of documenting it, of writing this narration, is not a plea for help or a warning to others. It is an inscription, a solidification of its claim. Every word I commit to this record, every confession of my folly, of the horrors I now witness, of the truth of the broken rule, is merely another link in the chain it fastens around my soul. My academic curiosity, once a source of pride, is now its most potent weapon against me. The paranoia deepens with each passing hour. I understand now that this entity wants me to write, to spread the knowledge, to act as its unwitting scribe, its herald into a world unprepared for its true nature. The lines between my own thoughts and its insidious suggestions blur more with every paragraph I construct. Is this my dread, or its perverse delight? Am I recounting my torment, or am I merely a conduit for its slow, methodical insinuation into the fabric of reality? The sin will never end takes on a new, terrifying meaning. It's not merely eternal damnation, but the perpetuation of the horror through my own actions, my desperate, futile attempt to record what has happened. I am compiling its grimoire, unknowingly, unwillingly. The Vatican's hidden rule wasn't to protect me, an obscure scholar in a quiet university town. It was to protect them, the institution, the faithful, the wider world from it. To keep the world blind, contained in its blissful ignorance. I was an unintended victim, a collateral casualty of a protocol designed for larger, more official transgressions. My scholarly pursuits were just the perfect, unwitting breach. I tried to understand the darkness, to dissect it, to analyze its historical trajectory, and in doing so, the darkness understood me far better. It saw an open door, a mind willing to venture where others feared to tread, and it walked right in. The demon's presence is no longer a subtle shift. It is absolute. It is not just a whisper. It is a parasitic entity intertwined with my very being. The physical manifestations are more frequent, more undeniable. My reflection sometimes shows not my own eyes, but a flicker of something ancient, cold, and utterly malevolent. The voice cracks into something inhuman, even in casual conversation. The cold dread is a constant companion, pressing down on my chest, making every breath a conscious effort. I understand now that this recording, these very words, are not just a record. They are binding. They are a spell, a permanent chronicle of my failure and the entity's triumph. Each sentence is another link in the chain it fastens around my soul. I am merely a conduit now, a living reliquary for a truth that should have remained buried. I must keep writing, even though I know every word seals my fate, and perhaps the fate of others. If you're still here, maybe the darkness hasn't claimed you yet, but it listens. It always listens. Before you leave this story behind, leave a mark of your own. Subscribe so you don't wander these halls alone. Like this video if you dare to hear more confessions like mine. And tell me in the comments, what rule would you never break, even in the dark? Lights low, volume high. The next story is already waiting for you.